Before we start our story, write in the comments which country you're watching the video from. We'd love to read them. Enjoy listening. The rain pounded against the asphalt of North Ashland Avenue, a relentless drumbeat that echoed through the Chicago night. Streetlights flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the brick row houses that lined the block, their windows dark and indifferent. Inside one of those apartments, a cramped, second-floor unit with peeling paint and a sagging couch, Emily Carter stood frozen, her hands trembling around the handle of a battered suitcase. The air smelled of stale beer and damp drywall, a scent she'd grown numb to over the past 5 years. Across the room, Jake Miller loomed in the doorway to the kitchen, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You're nothing without me. You hear that, Emily? Nothing." His words slurred slightly. The edge of a whiskey was sharpening his anger. He jabbed a finger at her, his unshaven face twisted into a sneer. "Pack your crap and get out. I'm done with you." Emily's chest tightened, a familiar ache spreading beneath her ribs. She'd heard this before, his rants about how she'd be lost without him, how he was the only thing keeping her afloat. Tonight, though, it was different. This wasn't just another fight that would end with him passing out on the couch and her creeping back to bed, pretending it never happened. This time he meant it. The argument had started over money, as it always did. He demanded $10,000, money she didn't even have, for some vague business deal with his buddies from the bar. She'd said no, her voice quiet but firm, and that had set him off. 5 years, Jake, she said, her throat dry. 5 years I've put up with this. And now you're throwing me out, because I won't bankroll your next bad idea. He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that made her flinch. "You think you're so smart, huh? You think I'd stick around for you? You're nobody, Emily. Without me, you're done, out on the street, begging for scraps. Go on then. Get the hell out of my place." His place. The words stung more than they should have. This apartment, 2 bedrooms, a leaky faucet, and a view of the alley, wasn't even his. They'd rented it together, scraping by on her paychecks from the bank until she quit 3 years ago to support his dreams. Dreams that turned into late nights at the bar, empty promises, and bruises she'd hidden under long sleeves. She wanted to scream, to throw it all back in his face, but the fight had drained out of her. Instead, she zipped the suitcase shut, the sound sharp in the tense air, and grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled the apartment key from her pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table, where it landed with a dull clink next to an empty beer bottle. "You win." Jake didn't move as she brushed past him, her shoulder grazing his arm. She half expected him to grab her, to yank her back like he'd done before. But he just stood there, smirking. The door creaked as she opened it, and the cold hit her like a slap, rain-soaked wind whipping through the stairwell. She stepped out, pulling the hood of her coat up, and let the door slam shut behind her. The lock clicked, final and unforgiving. Outside, the street was a blur of wet shadows and headlights. The L train rumbled in the distance, its metallic groan blending with the hiss of tires on the slick road. Emily descended the concrete steps of the building, her suitcase thudding against each one, and stopped at the curb. Rain plastered her dark hair to her face, seeping through her coat, but she barely felt it. Her mind was spinning, replaying his words, "You're nothing without me." 5 years of cooking his dinners, washing his clothes, believing his lies, and this was where it ended. Under a flickering streetlight, alone. She glanced back at the window. The curtains twitched, and for a split second, she saw a silhouette. Not Jake's, but slighter, feminine. A woman. Her stomach lurched. So that was it. He wasn't just kicking her out, he was replacing her. The realization burned, hot and bitter, but it also lit something else inside her. A spark she hadn't felt in years. Anger, yes, but more than that. Resolve. Emily turned away, her boots splashing through a puddle as she crossed to her car, an old Ford Focus parked crookedly against the curb. The paint was chipped, the driver's side mirror cracked, but it was hers, bought with her own money before Jake had convinced her to sell everything else. She tossed the suitcase into the back seat, the damp fabric squeaking against the upholstery, and slid behind the wheel. The engine sputtered to life, coughing like it resented being woken up, and she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. "You'll regret this, Jake," she muttered, her breath fogging in the chilly air. The words hung there, quiet but heavy, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep yet. She didn't know where she was going. Maybe to Sarah's place in Evanston, maybe just to drive until the gas ran out, but she knew she wasn't done. Not yet. The windshield wipers squeaked across the glass, smearing the rain into streaks of light. Emily shifted the car into gear, the tires crunching over gravel as she pulled away from the curb. Behind her, the apartment building faded into the storm, its windows glowing faintly against the dark. She didn't look back again. The road stretched out ahead, slick and endless, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her life shift, not lighter, but different. Like something was waking up inside her, something she'd forgotten she had. The rain kept falling, a steady roar that drowned out the city's hum. She drove north, past the neon signs of late-night diners and the skeletal frames of construction cranes, her mind drifting to the past. 5 years ago, she'd been someone else, someone with a job, a plan, a spark. Jake had dulled that, chipped away at it until she barely recognized herself. But tonight, standing in that rain, hearing him call her nothing, she felt it flicker again. Not much, just an ember, but enough to keep her going. She stopped at a red light, the intersection empty except for a lone taxi idling across the street. The radio crackled faintly, some old Springsteen song about running away, and she let her head rest against the seat. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. Probably Jake, gloating or threatening, or maybe Sarah checking in. She'd deal with it later. For now, she just needed to breathe, to think. The light turned green, and she pressed the gas, the car lurching forward into the night. Whatever came next, she'd face it on her own terms. Jake thought he'd broken her, but he'd misjudged one thing. She wasn't nothing. Not anymore. And soon, he'd see that for himself. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time Emily pulled into the parking lot of Sarah's apartment building in Evanston, a squat brick complex perched on the edge of Lake Michigan. The clock on the dashboard glowed 11:47, its green digits casting a faint light across her tired face. She killed the engine, the Ford Focus shuddering to a stop, and sat there for a moment, listening to the distant crash of waves against the shore. The air smelled of wet earth and gasoline, seeping through the cracked window she'd forgotten to roll up. Her suitcase slumped in the back seat, a silent reminder of the night she'd just left behind. With a sigh, she grabbed it and stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel as she made her way to the entrance. Sarah buzzed her in without a word, the intercom crackling like static on an old radio. The stairwell was narrow, its walls stained with years of neglect, and Emily climbed to the third floor, her breath hitching with each step. The door to apartment 304 swung open before she could knock, and there stood Sarah, 30 years old, wiry and sharp-eyed, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun. She wore a faded Cubs sweatshirt and pajama pants, a mug of coffee steaming in her hand despite the late hour. "Jesus, Em, you look like hell," Sarah said, stepping aside to let her in. Her voice was blunt, but warm, the kind of honesty Emily had always leaned on. "What happened?" Emily dropped the suitcase by the door and shrugged off her soaked coat, letting it fall in a heap on the linoleum. The apartment was small but cozy, a sagging couch piled with blankets, a TV flickering with some late-night talk show, and a kitchenette that smelled of brewed coffee and hairspray. She collapsed onto the couch, the springs groaning under her weight, and ran a hand through her damp hair. "Jake kicked me out," she said simply, her voice flat. "Told me I'm nothing without him and to get lost." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the mug. "That bastard. I told you he was a dead end. Em. 5 years with that guy. And this is what you get? Kicked to the curb like trash?" Emily didn't answer right away. She stared at the TV, where a comedian was cracking jokes to a laughing audience, the sound muted but the smiles loud. Her mind drifted back, unbidden, to 3 years ago. She'd been 29 then, working as a teller at First Midwest Bank, counting out 20s and dreaming of something bigger. Jake had swept in with his crooked grin and big talk. Promises of a construction business, a house in the suburbs, a life she'd wanted to believe in. She'd quit her job for him, cashed out her savings to invest in his plans. The first time he'd hit her was after a poker game went south, his fist slamming into her arm as he blamed her for not believing in him. She'd stayed anyway, convinced she could fix him. "You're right," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the hum of the radiator. "He's always been like this. I just didn't want to see it." Sarah set her mug on the coffee table and sat beside her, the couch dipping under her weight. "So what now? You're not going back, are you?" No, the word came out sharper than Emily intended, a spark of defiance cutting through her exhaustion. "I'm done with him. Done with all of it." Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good. You can crash here as long as you need. We'll figure it out tomorrow." Emily managed a tired smile in return, but her thoughts were already racing. She didn't want to just crash. She wanted to fight back, to prove Jake wrong. The idea felt distant, blurry, but it was there, simmering beneath the ache in her chest. Sarah handed her a blanket, and she pulled it over her shoulders, the soft fabric a small comfort against the night's chill. They sat in silence for a while, the TV flickering, the lake's rhythm seeping through the walls. Emily's eyes grew heavy, but before sleep could take her, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out, the screen lighting up with a text from Jake. "Pick up your stuff today, or it's going in the dumpster." Her jaw clenched, the spark flaring into something hotter. She tossed the phone onto the table, the clatter loud in the quiet room. "He's not getting rid of me that easy," she muttered. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Emily didn't answer right away. She stood, crossing to the window that overlooked the lake. The water stretched out, black and endless under the cloudy sky, its surface rippling with the last of the rain. She thought about the apartment on North Ashland, the life she'd built there, piece by piece, only to have Jake tear it down in a single night. But it wasn't his to destroy, not really. Something nagged at her, a memory she couldn't quite grasp, buried in the chaos of the past 5 years. "I'm going downtown tomorrow," she said, turning back to Sarah. "I need to see a lawyer. Figure out what's mine and what's not." Sarah grinned, leaning back on the couch. "That's my girl. Hit him where it hurts." Emily nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting to a moment she hadn't thought about in years. She'd been unpacking boxes when they first moved into that apartment, Jake complaining about the rent while she sorted through old papers. There'd been a letter from her grandma, something about the place, something important. She couldn't remember the details, but it tugged at her now, insistent and sharp. "Mind if I poke around your storage closet?" she asked, glancing at Sarah. "I left some stuff here a while back. Might be useful." Sarah waved a hand. "Go for it. Just don't wake me up when you start rummaging." Emily crossed the room to the narrow closet by the kitchen, its door creaking as she pulled it open. Inside were stacks of boxes, Christmas decorations, old magazines, a tangle of extension cords. She knelt, pushing aside a bag of yarn, and spotted a familiar cardboard box tucked in the corner. Her name was scrawled on the side in faded marker, the edges worn from years of being shoved around. She dragged it out, dust tickling her nose, and lifted the lid. The contents were a jumble of her past, photos from high school, a cracked coffee mug from her first job, a bundle of letters tied with string. She untied the knot, her fingers brushing against yellowed envelopes, and pulled one out. The handwriting was her grandma's, spidery and precise, dated 6 years ago. She skimmed the first line, Emily about the apartment on Ashland, and her breath caught. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she read on, the words blurring into a revelation she hadn't seen coming. "So that's it," she whispered, her voice trembling with something between shock and triumph. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, her mind already racing ahead to the morning. The lake murmured outside, a steady pulse that matched the growing certainty in her chest. Jake thought he'd won, but he didn't know what she'd just found, what she was about to do with it. She closed the box and stood, the blanket slipping from her shoulders as she turned back to the window, the night stretching out before her like a challenge she was finally ready to meet.
Morning broke over Evernstone with a grey haze, the kind of damp chill that clung to everything. Emily walk on Sarah's couch, her neck stiff from the lumpy cushions, the blanket tangled round her legs. The apartment was quiet except for the faint drip of the kitchen faucet and the hum of traffic filtering through the window. She rubbed her eyes, the events of last night crashing back Jake's voice, the rain, the letter now tucked in her coat pocket. It felt heavier than it should, 18 sheet of paper carrying the weight of a secret she hadn't fully processed. She sat up, running her fingers through her hair, and glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:15. Sarah was still asleep, the bedroom door creaked open just enough to hear her soft snores. Emily slipped into the bedroom, splashing cold water on her face. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, a hardness in her jaw she hadn't noticed before. She thought about the letter again, her grandma's words looping in her mind. The apartment on Shorent is yours, Emily. I made sure of it. It didn't make sense and not completely, but it was enough to get her moving. She dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and a faded sweater, and grabbed her coat. The letter crinkled as she patted the pocket, a small reassurance against the uncertainty ahead. The drive to downtown Chicago was a blur of morning rush honking horns, the screech of the L train overhead, the bitter scent of exhaust mingling with the greasy aroma of hot dog stands. She parked near State Street, the loop buzzing with car motors in suites and baristas calling out orders from coffee carts. The lawyer's office was on the 5th floor of a glass-fronted building, its lobby all polished marble and fake plants. Emily took the elevator up, her stomach twisting as the numbers climbed. She hadn't slept much, but adrenaline kept her sharp. The lawyer, a wiry man named Paul with glasses perched on each nose, greeted her with a handshake and a stack of papers already spread across his desk. So, he said, peering at her over the rims, you think this apartment's in your name? Not think, Emily replied, pulling the letter from her pocket and sliding it across the desk. No. My grandma left it to me 6 years ago. Jake and I moved in after she passed, but he always acted like it was it. Paul skimmed the letter, chest brow furrowing as he flipped through a file on his desk. Higher. Well, you're right, this date's got your name on it. Drafted to you outright, no liens, no signers. Problem is, your husband's been signing the lease with the landlord for the past few years. He's got a new one now, with some woman named Katie listed as a tenant. Emily's breath out. Katie. The name hit her like a slap, dragging up a memory she'd buried deep. High school, junior year, Katie Reynolds, all sharp smiles and sharp elbows, stealing Emily's science project and pissing Katie off as her own. The teacher hadn't believed Emily's protests, and Katie had walked through with the while Emily nursed the sting of betrayal. She'd lost touch with her after graduation, but the resentment lingered, a quiet bruise that never quite healed. Yeah, Paul said, tapping a pen against the desk. Katie Reynolds. Mean anything to you? More than you'd think, Emily muttered, her hands curling into fists. She leaned back in the chair, the letter creaking under her weight, and let the pieces fall into place. Jake kicking her out, the shade in the window, and now Katie her old rival moving into her apartment. It wasn't just a breakup, it was a takeover, a calculated shove to push her out of her own life. Paul cleared his throat, pulling her back. Legally, the place is yours, but Jake could drag this out in court for months if he fights it. The lease complicated things, landlord might not care who's on the deed if the rent's paid. Emily nodded, her mind racing. What do I need to do? Get proof, he said, handing her the letter back. This is a start, but you need more witnesses, documents, anything tying you to the property before Jake started playing house. I drift a notice, but you'll have to move fast. She thanked him and left, the elevator ride down feeling like a descent into a storm she'd sold in white. Outside, the city pulsed around her, street vendors hawking newspapers, the clank of a construction crane, the sharp tongue of diesel in the air. She walked to her car, her boots scuffing the sidewalk, and slid behind the wheel. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the dashboard, the letter burning a hole in her pocket. She could go back to Sarah's, lick her wounds, let it all fade. But the image of Jake and Katie in her apartment, her home lit a fire she'd solved and ignored. The drive to North Shore was automatic, her hands steady on the wheel despite the tremor in her chest. The neighborhood looked different in daylight, greyer, tired, the brick buildings sagging under the weight of years. She parked a block away, near a corner store with a flickering Budweiser sign, and walked the rest of the distance. The street was quiet, just the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement and the distant bark of a dog. She stopped across from the building, leaning against a rostered street sign, and watched. Her breath hitched as the door swung open. Jake stepped out, his jacket slung over one shoulder, laughing at something. Behind him came Katie, tall, blondie, her smirk as familiar as a bad dream. They stood on the stoop, Yika's arm brushing hers, their voices carrying in snippets over the wind. "She's gone for good," he said, loud enough for Emily to hear. "Place is ours now." Katie laughed, a sound that cut straight through Emily's ribs. "Good riddance. Always thought she was better than me." Emily's nails dug into her palms, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to storm across the street, scream until her throat bled, yank her and bot out by the hair. But she stayed put, her body rooted to the spot, her mind spinning with what Paul had said. Proof. She needed proof, not a fight. She ducked behind a parked van as Jake glanced her way, just skimming the street before turning back to Katie. They disappeared inside, the door slamming shut with a toy that caught in her bones. She exhaled, shaky but resolute, and slipped back to her car. The engine sputtered as she started it, the noise jarring in the quiet. Her phone sat in the cup holder, screen dark, but she didn't touch it not yet. She drove a few blocks, pulling over near a gas station with a flickering neon sign, and let her head rest against the steering wheel. The memory of Katie's smirk gnawed at her, dragging her back to that high school classroom, the humor turn, the helplessness. She'd let it go 10, but not now. Not when it was her life on the line. Her fingers brushed the letter again, and she pulled it out, rereading the lines in the dim light. "The apartment on Shorent is yours, Emily. Don't let anyone take it from you." Her grandma's voice caught in her head, soft but firm, a feeling she hadn't known she needed. She folded it carefully, tucking it away, and straightened up. Jake and Katie thought hate on, but they didn't know what she hit or who she could call. She grabbed her phone, scrolling through contacts until she landed on a name she hadn't dialed in years. Then Sarah's brother, and Ichtop, who had her a favor from way back. Her thumb hovered over the call button, hesitating flickering, then pressed down. The line rang twice before Chess Gruff voice answered. "Emily. Been a while. You okay?" "Not really," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "I need your help. It'll be quick."
He paused, the sound of a TV blaring in the background. "Name it." She glanced out the window, the gas station's lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and felt the fire in her chest flare brighter. Whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone. The afternoon sky hung low over Chicago, a blanket of slate-gray clouds pressing down on the city. Emily sat in the passenger seat of Dan's pickup truck, the rumble of the engine vibrating through her bones as they turned onto North Ashland Avenue. Dan, Sarah's older brother, a broad-shouldered ex-cop with a buzz cut and a perpetual squint, kept his eyes on the road, one hand resting on the wheel, the other tapping a rhythm against his knee. The cab smelled of leather and cigarette smoke, a faint trace of his old patrol days lingering in the air. Emily clutched a manila envelope in her lap, the edges creased from her nervous grip. Inside were the letter from her grandma, a copy of the deed, and a grainy still from the security footage Dan had pulled, a blurry shot of Jake looming over her in the doorway, his fist raised, her face turned away. "You sure about this?" Dan asked, his voice low and gravelly. He glanced at her, his hazel eyes sharp beneath the brim of a worn baseball cap. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "I'm sure. He doesn't get to take this from me." Dan grunted, a sound that might have been approval, and pulled into a parking spot half a block from the apartment building. The street was quiet, the lunchtime bustle along faded, leaving only the occasional clatter of a garbage can or the distant wail of a siren. Emily stepped out, her boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud, and adjusted her coat. The envelope felt like a shield, thin but solid, as she followed Dan toward the building. Behind them, Paul's sedan rolled up, the lawyer climbing out with a briefcase and a clipboard tucked under his arm. A sheriff's deputy trailed him, a stocky man in a tan uniform, his badge glinting in the muted light. They'd planned it over the phone last night, after Dan had met her at a diner near the gas station. He'd brought the footage, pulled from a favor with an old buddy still on the force, and listened as she laid out the story. Jake's betrayal, Katie's smug takeover, the apartment that was hers by right. Dan hadn't hesitated. "I'll get you in," he'd said, sipping black coffee. "But you've got to finish it." Paul had filed the eviction notice that morning, armed with the deed and Emily's testimony, and now here they were, standing outside the peeling green door of her old life. The deputy knocked, a sharp rap that echoed down the stairwell. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears, each second stretching into eternity. Footsteps thudded inside, heavy and uneven, and the door swung open. Jake stood there, unshaven and bleary-eyed, a beer can dangling from his hand. His smirk faltered when he saw her, then twisted into something uglier as his gaze flicked to Dan, Paul, and the deputy. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, stepping forward. "You're not stepping foot in here again, Emily. I told you you're done." The deputy held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, step back. I've got an eviction notice here for you and a Catherine Reynolds. This property belongs to Emily Carter, effective immediately." Jake's face went slack, the beer can slipping slightly in his grip. "What? That's bullshit. This is my place. She's got nothing." Paul cut in, unfolding the clipboard. "Deed says otherwise, Mr. Miller. Dated 6 years ago. Gifted to Miss Carter by her grandmother. You've been squatting on her property, and the lease you signed with Ms. Reynolds is void. Here's the paperwork if you'd like to read it." Emily watched as Jake's eyes darted between them, confusion giving way to rage. He turned on her, his voice rising. "You think you can pull this? You're nothing, Emily. You can't just—" "Shut it," Dan growled, stepping forward. His bulk filled the doorway, a quiet threat that made Jake flinch. "She's got the law on her side. You don't." Before Jake could respond, a voice called from inside, high and sharp, laced with panic. "Jake? What's going on?" Katie appeared behind him, her blonde hair tangled, a bathrobe cinched tight around her waist. Her eyes widened when she saw Emily, recognition flashing across her face, followed by a sneer. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me. What's she doing here?" "Taking back what's mine," Emily said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She stepped past Dan, meeting Katie's glare head-on. "You thought you could waltz in and steal my life? Not this time." Katie laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Your life? Please. You were always a doormat. High school. Now doesn't matter. Jake picked me because I'm—" "Enough," the deputy interrupted, handing Jake the eviction notice. "You've got 30 minutes to pack what's yours and leave. Anything left behind becomes Miss Carter's to handle." Jake crumpled the paper in his fist, his face reddening. "This is my home. You can't do this. I'll fight it, you'll see." Paul adjusted his glasses, unfazed. "You can try. Court will side with the deed. Save yourself the lawyer fees, and go quietly." For a moment, Jake looked ready to swing, his shoulders tensing, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Emily braced herself, years of his temper flashing through her mind. The shouting, the shoves, the nights she'd spent curled up on the bathroom floor. But Dan shifted closer, a wall of muscle between them, and Jake deflated. He turned to Katie, his voice low and desperate. "Get your stuff. We're out." Katie's sneer vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock. "What? No, I'm not leaving. This is ridiculous." She grabbed Jake's arm, but he shook her off, storming back inside. She hesitated, then bolted after him, her voice rising into a shrill protest. Emily stood on the stoop, watching them disappear into the apartment. The deputy followed, clipboard in hand, while Paul lingered beside her, muttering about filing fees. Dan clapped a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "You okay?" She nodded, though her legs felt unsteady. "Yeah, Just didn't expect it to feel like this. He grunted again, a half smile tugging at his lips. Winning's messy sometimes. Inside, the sounds of chaos spilled out, drawers slamming, Katie's muffled curses, Jake's boots stomping across the hardwood. Emily stepped over the threshold, her breath catching as she took in the familiar space. The couch was shoved against the wall, stained with beer rings, the kitchen counter cluttered with takeout boxes, her old curtains hanging crooked above the window. It smelled of neglect, of Jake's life overriding hers, but beneath it, she caught a faint trace of the lavender candle she'd burned years ago. Her chest ached, not with sadness, but with something fiercer a reclaiming. Jake emerged from the bedroom, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes wild. He stopped when he saw her, the fight draining from his posture. "Emily," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know it was yours. I swear. Let's work this out. Don't do this." She stared at him, his pleading face a mirror of the man she'd once loved, the man she'd convinced herself she could save. "You said I was nothing," she replied, her tone cold and even. "Look who's nothing now." He opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders slumping. Katie shoved past him, a backpack dangling from one hand, her bathrobe swapped for jeans and a hoodie. She shot Emily a venomous glare but said nothing, her heels clicking as she stormed down the stairs. Jake lingered, his gaze dropping to the floor, then followed her out. The deputy trailed them, barking a reminder about the 30-minute deadline. Emily stood alone in the doorway, the apartment silent except for the hum of the fridge. Dan and Paul waited outside, their voices a low murmur on the stoop. She walked to the window, peering through the smudge glass at Jake and Katie below, him tossing his bag into a beat-up Chevy, her pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. They were leaving, but it didn't feel finished. Not yet. She turned away, her eyes catching on a crack in the wall she'd patched years ago, a memory of quieter days before Jake's shadow swallowed them. Her fingers brushed the envelope in her pocket, the weight of her victory sinking in. She'd won this round, but as she watched Jake's car peel out into the rain-slick street, she whispered to herself, "This isn't over yet." Something lingered, an edge she couldn't name, a step she hadn't taken. The apartment was hers again, but what came next was still unwritten. The rain had stopped by the next morning, leaving North Ashland Avenue slick and gleaming under a weak sun. Emily stood in the middle of the apartment, a paint roller in her hand, the sharp scent of fresh latex cutting through the stale air. The walls, once a dingy beige stained with years of neglect, were halfway to a soft cream, the color brightening the room inch by inch. Sarah knelt nearby, taping off the baseboards, her Cubs sweatshirt dusted with flecks of paint. Dan lounged on the couch, now shoved to the center of the room, a slice of pizza in one hand and a beer in the other. The floor creaked underfoot, the old hardwood scuffed but solid, and the window stood open, letting in the hum of the city. Car horns, a distant train, the chatter of neighbors on the stoop below. "Looking good, Em," Sarah said, wiping her hands on her jeans as she stood. She grinned, surveying the half-painted wall. "A hell of a lot better than when that jerk was here." Emily dipped the roller into the paint can, the thick drip of cream pooling on the tray. "Yeah, feels like mine again." She ran the roller up the wall, covering a patch where Jake's fist had once left a dent, a fight over a lost bet, his anger spilling into the plaster. She'd patched it then, hiding the mark, but now she painted over it, erasing him stroke by stroke. Dan took a swig of his beer, the bottle clinking as he set it on the coffee table. "Told you it'd work out. Guy didn't have a leg to stand on once you brought the law in." Emily nodded, her arm moving in steady arcs. Yesterday's showdown replayed in her mind. Jake on his knees, Katie's panicked exit, the weight of the eviction notice in her hands. It had felt like a victory, sharp and clean, but the edges were softening now, settling into something quieter. She'd slept on the couch last night, the apartment empty except for her suitcase and a blanket Sarah had brought. The silence had been deafening after years of Jake snoring, his muttered curses, but it was hers. For the first time in too long, it was hers. Sarah grabbed a slice of pizza from the box on the table, the cheese stretching as she pulled it free. "So what's the plan now? You staying here for good?" "I think so," Emily said, stepping back to the wall. The paint glistened, wet and new, catching the light from the window. Need to get some furniture. Fix the sink. It's still leaking. But yeah, this is home. Dan chuckled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Better than crashing at Sarah's. Huh? Her couch'll kill your back. Hey, Sarah shot back, tossing a napkin at him. That couch saved her ass. Show some respect. Emily smiled, a real one that tugged at her cheeks, and set the roller down. She crossed to the kitchenette, grabbing a slice for herself. The pizza was warm, the crust crisp, and she leaned against the counter, chewing slowly. The room felt alive again. Laughter, the clink of bottles, the faint buzz of a radio Dan had plugged in, playing some old rock tune. It was a far cry from the night Jake had thrown her out, the rain pounding her into the street. She glanced at the spot by the door where she'd stood, suitcase in hand, his voice ringing in her ears, "You're nothing without me." The memory stung, but it was fading, overwritten by the paint, the company, the life she was building back. Her phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with Jake's name. She froze, the pizza halfway to her mouth, and Sarah noticed, her grin fading. "Don't tell me that's him." Emily set the slice down, wiping her hands on a rag. "It is." She picked up the phone, the message glowing. I'm sorry. Can we talk? I messed up." Her thumb hovered over the screen, a flicker of doubt creeping in. She'd loved him once, 5 years of mornings, fights, fleeting good days. Could he mean it? "Don't do it," Dan said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. He sat up, the couch creaking under his weight. "Guy's a leech. He's just crawling back, 'cause he's got nowhere else." Sarah nodded, crossing her arms. Dan's right. He had his chance. Hell, he had 5 years of chances. You don't owe him a damn thing. Emily stared at the screen, Jake's words blurring into the hum of the radio. She thought of the bruises, the empty promises, the way he'd looked at her like she was less than nothing. Her finger pressed down, and the call went silent as she hung up, the phone clattering back to the counter. "You're right," she said, her voice firm. "He's done." Sarah clapped her on the shoulder, a spark of pride in her eyes. "That's my girl. Now let's finish this wall before the pizza gets cold." They painted into the afternoon, the room transforming around them. Dan hauled out a bag of Jake's forgotten trash, old socks, a broken lamp, while Sarah blasted the radio, singing off-key to a Springsteen song. Emily moved between them, her hand steady, the ache in her chest easing with each swipe of the roller. The apartment wasn't perfect. The sink dripped, the floorboards groaned, but it was hers, and that was enough. Later, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows through the window, Emily stood alone in the kitchen. Sarah and Dan had gone to grab more paint from the hardware store, leaving her with the quiet. She poured a glass of water, the tap sputtering, and leaned against the counter, gazing at the city lights flickering to life. Chicago stretched out beyond the glass, a tangle of steel and neon, its pull steady and familiar. She'd thought she'd lost herself here, drowned in Jake's shadow, but standing in this half-painted room, she felt whole again. "I thought I was nothing without him," she said softly, turning to Sarah as she walked back in, a paint can in her arms. "Turns out I was me all along." Sarah set the can down, her grin soft. "You did it, Em. You're the boss of your life now." Emily nodded, taking a sip of water, the coolness grounding her. She thought about the past week, the rain, the fight, the letter that had changed everything. It wasn't just about the apartment. It was about her, clawing her way back from the edge. She crossed to the couch, sinking into it, and let her head rest against the cushion. The city hummed outside, a rhythm she'd forgotten she loved. Her eyes drifted to the box of papers Sarah had brought from Evanston, now tucked against the wall. She'd skimmed most of it that night at Sarah's, but something nagged at her, a loose thread she hadn't pulled. She stood, crossing to it, and lifted the lid. The letters from her grandma were still there, a bundle of faded envelopes tied with string. She untied them, flipping through until one caught her eye. Smaller, unopened. The postmark smudged, but dated a month before her grandma's death. Her fingers hesitated, then tore it open, the paper crisp despite the years. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faint. Emily, if you're reading this, you found your way. The apartment's yours, but there's more. Check the bank on Clark Street. I left you something to start over. Love, Grandma. A safety deposit key slipped out, small and silver, clinking onto the floor. Emily's breath caught, her heart thudding as she picked it up. She turned to Sarah, who'd paused mid-paint stroke, watching her. What's that? I don't know, Emily said, a smile breaking across her face, small but real. But I'm going to find out. She slipped the key into her pocket, the weight of it a promise, and turned back to the window. The city glowed brighter now, its lights winking like stars, and she felt the future shift, open, uncertain hers. Thank you for spending time with our heroes. Share your thoughts in the comments if this story resonated with your heart. Like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss other touching stories. Share this video with your friends. It might inspire something important.